Just play the damn thing.
I've been reflecting a lot on my YouTube career thus far, as I had just, here in the last few months, just passed over my 9-year anniversary on YouTube. This is my 10th year. It will be 10 years in November, I believe. And, what you might not know about me, I never go back and watch any of my older videos. Generally, for the most part, once I post it, that's the last time I see it. Occasionally, I may go back and look at something if I need to look something up that I've done in the past. But generally speaking, I don't look at them. At any rate, I've learned a lot about what to do, and specifically as it relates to this video, what not to do. So I thought I would share some mistakes that I made, early on. Looking back now, I think are mistakes that I probably could have corrected or wish that I had put more effort into correcting. So if you are about to start your own YouTube channel, specifically if it's a guitar channel or a guitar related channel or music related channel, something similar to what I do, these are some things that you might want to consider before you launch your own channel, especially in today's market, because today it's even more saturated now than it was when I got started. And if you're not doing these things the way that the YouTube algorithm considers to be the right way to do them, and that is determined based on what YouTube viewers want to see from their creators and from the videos that they watch. If you're not following those guidelines to some degree, you're going to have a real hard time building an audience. And to be clear, some of these things could have simply been fixed with, by simply just investing a little bit more money. So of course it's not lost on me that some of these things, these mistakes that I was making were simply because this is the equipment that I had to work with, and this is, that's what I had. That said, a lot of this technology has advanced quite a bit, and I still recommend if you're able to invest a little bit of money in some areas, you're probably going to be glad that you did in the long run. So, without any further ado, let's get into some of this stuff, shall we? Number one. Bad lighting. The lighting of the early days of my channel was absolutely horrible. For my very first video, I didn't know that I needed a light at all. If you go back and watch that video, I think you can barely see me in it, if I remember correctly. Like I said, I haven't gone back and watched it, but regardless, it was really bad. Eventually I moved up to using like a desk lamp with a regular household light bulb, and then eventually I found a really cheap $20, $30 little like LED light that I could mount on top of my camera that I had to crank that thing all the way up and basically whatever light I got out of it is what I got out of it. If it wasn't enough light to do the job, in most cases, no. But again, it's what I had. Now I'm using what they call cob lights, and I think you can probably see one of them here just up in the corner, the one that I have lit up behind me, with a softbox lantern on it. As well as another one, what's called my key light right here. In this particular room that I'm in, also has 2 windows with a lot of sunlight coming in. So honestly, I could just about shut these 2 off and still probably have a pretty decent look to this shot. Again, I didn't want to spend a whole lot of money on lighting at the time because one, most of my money was going into guitar gear to demo products, and I didn't have much understanding about what I was buying, and much less how to use it when I got it. So what I did learn, though, there are some really good affordable lighting options that that did improve things for me quite a bit. There's a brand called Mount Dog that I think I bought one of their lights on Amazon for like the whole light, the stand, and everything for like $50. It was a really good bicolor light that more than did the job for a long time. Matter of fact, I still have it here as a backup. I really wish that I had spent the money on something like that and had that handy the first time I turned on the camera. Number 2, speaking of cameras, not knowing how to operate mine. My very first few videos were shot on a couple of really cheap action cameras, Call of Duty action cameras that I think I bought for like $25 a piece or something like that. They did shoot in 1080p, which at that time was still the standard, but they also had the wide angle thing going, you couldn't see, at all. It didn't have you couldn't see it. I just kind of had to point it in the direction and hope that I got everything that I needed to get into the shot, I think I think I still have those laying around somewhere. If I have to, I'll have to dig them out sometime and show you guys what they work. It's pretty funny now, but eventually, again, not knowing much about cameras, I moved up to a model from Nikon called the D3200, I think, or 3300. It was the D3300 that I had. It was okay. Would have, had I known more about how to operate cameras, it probably would have done the job. Other than the fact it didn't have a flip out screen, which is, I've since discovered is absolutely essential for YouTube. This camera has a screen right there, and it is really, really nice to be able to see, so that I can, as I'm talking to you, as I'm talking to the camera, I can see exactly what's in the shot and, how everything looks, as opposed to just going blind at it. So it was an upgrade, but, again, I should have put in a little bit more work into learning how to use that thing, and learning different settings. What some of these different settings mean. Like frames per second and the ISOs and depth of field, things of that nature. I'm certainly still not a camera expert to this day. Now I use a Sony ZV-E10, and the reason why I like this camera is because it's designed specifically for content creation like this, but also it's designed for people like me that that are still pretty stupid about cameras, just want to set it up, hit the red record button and go. There's a few options on it that I can turn on and off that for various different needs. Again, kind of idiot-proof stuff. Cameras like this weren't around back then, and if they were a lot more money I was willing to spend. Based on the equipment that I had, though, had I put in a little bit more effort into learning how to use it a little bit better, my videos probably would have looked a little bit better as well. Also made the mistake of shooting in like 60 frames per second, not knowing it, again, not knowing any better. Finally, somebody pointed out to me, I think it was Trey Xavier actually at a Facebook group, pointed out to me, he said, just set your camera 24 frames per second, you can thank me later. I took his advice. I set all my cameras at 24 frames per second. That's what I shoot in, and that's what all my videos are shot in 24 frames per second these days. So, and he's right. It's absolutely the most cinematic look. Number 3, bad audio. This was a result of me resisting learning anything about recording. And this is I was going to die on this hill if I had to. I did not want to learn to record, with a computer and an interface or any of that stuff. I didn't want to do it. It just seemed too daunting to me. I was afraid I was never going to figure it out, and I was never going to learn it. It seemed like a lot to learn, and it was. But, that was one of those, fears fears of technology as I was getting older. Finally, I got to the point that some of the older, the analog technology that I was trying to use, multi-track recorders and stuff like that, that I had been, learning to use throughout the process, were just making it way more tedious than it needed to be. And finally, I had to succumb to the fact that recording with a DAW in a computer was only going to simplify my life once I got over that small little learning curve. But that's the audio production side of it. Go back and listen to some of my older pedal demos. Most of them, again, I won't go back and watch or listen to any of that stuff. Unless I absolutely have to. I hate doing it. So, this is what it sounds like. All of my old videos make me cringe. So had I sucked it up and and humbled myself to learning, to finally to being willing to learn the technology that I was afraid to learn, had I not been so afraid of challenging myself, my audio would have improved a lot sooner than it did. No, I'm still not a master studio engineer or mixing, sound mixing technician or anything like that. I'm not any of those things. But I've learned enough that I can get it done well enough for a gear demo on YouTube. Number 4, my lackadaisical attire and a messy background. A lot of things were messy about my earlier videos. Sometimes I would wear sleeveless shirts or tank tops and stuff like that just didn't look real flattering. I know I'm not the best looking guy in the world or anything like that, and there are some people on YouTube that do wear sleeveless shirts in their videos, and they look great doing it. But for a guy like me, I wish I had set that rule up for myself a lot sooner than I did. I know I did post a video recently of myself, wearing a sleeveless T-shirt because it just happened to be while I was packing up my old house, and a video idea popped into my head right there that very moment. So I turned on the camera on my phone, and shot a video real quick to share share with some accessories, whatever it was on my mind. That was a very, very impromptu thing, but that was the exception, not the norm. I also had a lot of stuff, like clutter and stuff behind me in the background. That was it was just clutter. That's one of those things. If you're thinking about starting starting up a YouTube channel, and I don't know that I really had anybody ever comment on that. But it was one of those things that was always kind of in the back of my mind is, I just wish I had some place to put all of this crap, tuners and picks and stuff that were laying on top of the amps and things like that. Clean that shit off before you turn on the camera. So, you can see what I'm doing now. Everything here behind me looks relatively presentable. And part of that is also the lights and stuff that I've got going, back here on the rack, as just a little bit more ambiance and, something just to make it look a little bit cooler, and a little bit more of an inviting type of atmosphere. Number 5, a ridiculously long intro. Don't ask me why I ever thought that this was a good idea.
Today here at Robert's Guitar Dungeon, we're checking out the Depth Finder EQ from Amp Tweaker.
Yeah, that was like over 30 seconds, I think, and most of them were about that long. It took me a while to wake up from that. That was a big mistake. I still have an intro. Now my intro is 2.5 seconds long. Here's my intro now.
Just play the damn thing.
That's my intro, and honestly, I could probably do away with that if I wanted to. A lot of channels nowadays don't have intros. They don't have intro dialogue or anything. They just, get straight to it. Because the attention span of the YouTube viewer these days is about that wide. And a big, long 30-plus second intro like that is doing absolutely nothing for your viewer retention. And that is a metric that YouTube looks at very, very closely, specifically as it relates to referring your videos out to other viewers. Still some things I need to work on with that, but I've at least gotten better at that. Number 6, ridiculous fonts and titles. Okay, look, growing up, I've always hated boring text and fonts and and things like that. It was just boring to me, and it still is, to be honest. That's why I would find some really, really goofy or extravagant fonts to create my title page with or something like that. Titles and captions, I would add some color to it, something just to make it look, add a little pizzazz to it. The problem is it's, it tends to be, it gets a little off-putting to the viewer. The purpose of those things is to provide the viewer with the information that it's providing. The entertainment value is the video content, not the caption. So while I still like that stuff, I try not to use it quite as often as I used to. You might notice my captions are a little bit more boring, and they tend to be, general, Times New Roman font in white with maybe a little bit of, a really, really thin black background and shadows just so you can see it a little bit better. I try to stay away from the, from the crazy fonts and stuff like that now. And I wish that's one thing I wish I had done a lot sooner. Going back and looking at that stuff again, that's pretty, it makes me do this when I watch those old videos. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Number 7, bad thumbnails and video titles. My thumbnails for the longest time sucked, and I mean sucked bad. I would create them by, taking a screenshot out of the video somewhere, adding a crazy caption, the video title off to the side, top 10 worst guitar amplifiers ever, in a stupid looking font there off to the side. And that was it. That was my thumbnail. And that was horrible. A few of those, especially like the top worst amps and the top worst production guitars, those are like my best, very very best performing videos. I've left those alone, because they continue to perform so well even today. But generally speaking, most of those old, those old videos and those old crappy thumbnails were, they were just horrible, and maybe I should go back and fix some of those. I probably would have attracted a lot more viewers had I learned how to make thumbnails a lot sooner than I did. Nowadays, there's a lot more tools that are out there. There's Canva, there's Adobe Express, which is what I use now. Among others. There's a lot of tools out there, graphic design tools that we can use, that are out there for us specifically to create thumbnails, and make the initial presentation to the viewer inviting and bright and colorful and things like that. Make you want to click on the video, which is the whole point of the thumbnail and the video title. And, again, things that YouTube takes into consideration when promoting your video when you upload it. I mentioned video titles in this entry on this list as well, because my video titles were, would be something along the lines of, is this tube distortion clone pedal actually worth the money? Instead, the title of that video was
TC Electronic Tube Pilot Overdrive.
I know that a lot of people, you get a lot of people in Facebook groups in particular. Facebook groups have become the most toxic freaking place on the internet, as far as the guitar community goes, unfortunately. But you still got to listen to them to some degree. But people seem to get really upset about what they call clickbaity titles. I'm sorry, but you don't hate the player, hate the game. So we need to have those, again, quote unquote clickbaity titles in place, because it has to be there in order to attract the viewer and make you ask yourself, well, what, number one, what tube, what tube-driven overdrive pedal is he talking about? And two, is it really worth the hype compared to whatever the clone, whatever it's a clone of? You don't ask yourself those questions with a video title like TC Electronic Tube Pilot Overdrive. Sorry, we don't. So the next time you're complaining about a clickbaity title, please realize that it is that creator doing it the best that they can to do what YouTube's algorithm is telling us that they want us to do. But the bottom line is, I bet you a lot of those earlier videos would have attracted a lot more views if I had had more intriguing titles and more attractive thumbnails. That was one that I could have fixed a lot earlier than I did. Number 8. Videos were way too long. This one kind of goes hand in hand with the, with the ridiculously long intros and stuff. And again, there's still a few things that I could do to shorten these down. You shorten down my videos more than what they are. Right now I'm pretty comfortable at most gear demos being between 8 and 12 minutes, right? That's where you see most of my videos land. Occasionally, maybe a little bit shorter if it's just like a real simple 2 or 3 knob pedal. You heard me say a little bit ago, the viewer attention span on YouTube is about that wide. This is a video that I posted very recently, and this is the viewer retention on that video. You can see it drops off really, really steeply. And most of my videos will do this for some reason. Still one thing I have not figured out is what I need to do is sitting in front of this camera to keep you guys watching all the way to the very end, or at least close to it. Some videos tend to do better than others, but generally speaking, this is what most of them look like. They dropped off a lot faster though when when my videos were stretching well into 18-20 minute territory, and occasionally longer than that. Some of these guys are able to get away with it. Kyle Bull and Rick Beato and Henning Pauly are all able to put up videos as long as they want. You guys will sit there and watch them from front to back, no questions asked. I don't know how those guys are able to get away with it, but they are. That said, I think they're pretty much the exception, not the rule, and I think most creators, particularly people who are doing gear demos like myself, need to keep it in the 8 to 10 to 12 minute range tops. I had a hell of a time figuring out how to get my videos down inside that range, and what I needed to cut out to get them there. And I learned I needed to cut out the extra dialogue at the end. Nobody, I still needed to get better at this, but realistically, most of you guys don't seem to give a shit too much about my opinions at the end, and that's okay. The full track demos, need to be a minute or so, just, something to give you guys an idea of what a particular piece of gear sounds like with the, sounds like in a mix. I still include the playthrough demo because I want you guys just to be able to hear the pedal on its own without any kind of processing or mixing or anything like that going on. I think that's still important to some of you. Some of you have seem to find more value in that part of a gear demo. Some of you seem to find more value in the full track demo. So that's why I still leave both of those in there. But I have learned to cut down the dialogue and just stick to the information that you guys come to these to these videos to find out, and that's it. Some exceptions are videos like this one where it might be, 8 reasons why, or a top 10 list of, of this, or, whatever goofy ideas on my mind that particular day. These I can get away with stretching out a little bit longer, because I find that they're easier to retain your attention. The results of this video remain to be seen. Who knows? This thing could have tanked 10 minutes ago, and I don't know it yet. I won't find out until you will. Regardless, generally speaking, you guys will sit through videos like this a little bit more willingly. But had I learned to cut down the length of my videos a lot sooner, I think there's a lot of you out there that I have trained to watch the first 2 or 3 minutes of my videos and just click off for whatever reason. I think I would have avoided, unintentionally training you guys to do that had I focused on that a lot sooner than I did. So I'm sure if I thought about this a little bit longer, I could probably come up with a few other things to include on this list, but these are the main things. These are the main points and things that I still think about today. When I'm looking back again, reflecting on my YouTube career to this point. So yeah, I wish I had spent more money on a few things up front. Again, such as lighting. I strongly recommend if you're just getting started, put some money into lighting, put some money into a good camera. And spend some time and effort learning how to use these things. There are tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of resources and videos on YouTube that you can learn a lot from, in a very, very short amount of time. You don't need to be a professional videographer to do this stuff. And I'm certainly not trying to be and never have tried to be, but I did make my mistakes early on. And if I'm able to pass those on and so that you can learn from them and not make some of the same mistakes that I did, hopefully your channels will become successful a lot sooner and even more so than mine did. So let's have some fun with it. Comment down below. Tell me what else you still hate about my videos. Adios.